Welcome to another edition of Rebellion's educational series. Today we're going to tackle capital punishment as it's become very relevant in the news. And we are so lucky and unbelievably fortunate to have a living legend, Professor Dr. Austin Sarat, probably the most famous Amherst College professor since Robert Frost. And this is not something I say lightly, as Rebellion Research has had over 100 Amherst students the last 5 years. And I emailed them and said, is Professor Sarat the most famous professor since Robert Frost? And they all agreed. So Professor Sarat, thank you for coming on today.
Alex, thank you for that very, very kind introduction.
I'm not kind, Professor Sarat. I'm merely honest and exploratory. So let's jump right to it. We had the first federal death penalty enacted, 6 capital punishments, first time since 2003. Love to hear your reaction and take on that, sir.
So the federal death penalty is in some ways complicated, in some ways pretty straightforward. Let me start with what is straightforward about it. America's death penalty is afflicted with a variety of problems. The problems of America's death penalty are problems that challenge Central American values. What are those problems and what are those values? We know that the death penalty system today is afflicted with errors in the guilt phase, discrimination in the sentencing phase, and a series of botched executions. Errors in the guilt phase, what does that mean? That means that unfortunately in capital cases, we have a good record of convicting the innocent. That offends American values. What American value is that? Due process of law. In the sentencing phase, we know the best predictor of whether or not someone who's convicted of a capital crime will get a death sentence is the race of their victim. And when it comes to executing people, we know that lethal injection, the current method of execution used in the states and at the federal level, is the most unreliable technology of execution used in the United States over the course of the last 100 years. All of those problems afflict the federal death penalty. So that's what I would say is the kind of straightforward part of the story of the federal death penalty. The federal death penalty is no better than is the death penalty anywhere else.
Can you give our viewers some idea on the numbers? How unreliable are some of these processes? You mentioned a few modules, and so let's go through.
So let me just finish what I was about to say about the complicated part of the federal death penalty. So for people who believe in and respect our federal system, for people who believe in states' rights or federalism, what happens is the feds will prosecute someone in a capital case in states which themselves don't have the death penalty. So in addition to all the other problems of the federal death penalty, there's this complicated issue of federalism and whether the federal government should respect the preferences of states who have abolished the death penalty. Now, in terms of the statistics, the data, let's start with the guilt phase. Let's start with the process of determining whether or not someone who's been accused of a capital crime is in fact guilty of that crime. We know that about 160 people have been released from death rows across the United States after they've been convicted and sentenced, and after their appeals have been exhausted, they've been exonerated from death row. That means since 1976, when the death penalty was reinstituted in the United States, for every 9 people that we have executed, we've exonerated 1. So that's the error rate in the guilt phase. In the sentencing phase, we know that if you take everything else into account, people who murder white victims are 4 times more likely to get a death sentence than people who murder people of color. And finally, at the stage of execution, we know that since the beginning of the 20th century, 3% of every American execution has been botched. 3 out of 100 executions go wrong. And we know that of all the technologies, hanging, the gas chamber, the electric chair, lethal injection has the highest rate of mishap. About 7% of all lethal injections carried out in the United States are in some ways botched. So what do we know? Put all that together, And whatever one's abstract views about the death penalty or about its morality, we know that its administration is rife with error. The death penalty system in the United States is a broken system.
Well, it includes finality, which is something that, is a problem. When you think about cultural mass media, The Shawshank Redemption is one of the most famous movies of all time. Yet, after nearly 3 hours immersing yourself with these characters, the question of is Andy Dufresne innocent? I could not answer that question for love or money. And so that makes me wonder how well anyone can ever really know. But what about in the instance with Truman Capote's book when he profiled those two murderers? If they're open about it and they have admitted that they have committed such acts, are you okay then with the death penalty being administered, or then do you just because of the 7% issue?
Let's go. Let's go back and just think about what you said.
Mm-hmm.
So you said you watched The Shawshank Redemption, and at the end of the film, you were still undecided as to whether or not Andy Dufresne was guilty. That's great.
Mm-hmm.
More than 160 people have been released from death row. Why? Because those doubts were resolved and a mistake was identified. Those people should not have been convicted of the crimes that they were convicted of committing. And DNA has helped us see that. Sometimes what you have is people who acted as witnesses in those cases coming forward and saying that their testimony was false. So yes, there may be some cases where we really don't know, we can't really resolve. That's the job of the jury. The jury makes a decision, and that's the best we can do. But in the United States, we know that the death penalty system is prone to error. It's more prone to error than any other part of our criminal justice system. Why? Because the stakes are high, and it is the most politicized. Now, then you say, well, Austin, what happens if we have no doubt about someone's guilt? Should they be executed? Well, first of all, you then want to ask a different question. You want to say, does the death penalty in the United States make us safer, saner, or a better society? And the United States, as you know, is one of the few constitutional democracies in the world which continues to execute. So I think there's a lot of evidence that the death penalty system is broken. And even where we could have confidence that someone who was convicted of a capital crime is in fact guilty of that crime, the question is, how do we punish? And when it comes to the question of how we punish, we need to think about whether or not when we punish, we are respecting American values, whether we are being, if you will, the kinds of people, the kinds of society that we want to be. Does the death penalty make us safer, saner, and a better place? And I don't think there's any evidence that it makes us safer. It doesn't deter. And I don't think there's any evidence that the kinds of punishments that's meted out through capital punishment could not be dealt with in other ways. For example, through life imprisonment without parole.
So let's talk about your famous class murder. It was profiled on the cover of New York Times's style section, I think 2001, or maybe it was the art section, 2001, profiled your murder class. It is an internationally known class. In fact, it's one that when I've run into many other Amherst alums, it's everyone's favorite subject. It's probably the most famous Amherst class of the last quarter century. So how has that evolved with technology and time? Tell us about that, Professor.
Thanks, Alex. I started to teach murder actually in the shadow of the O.J. Simpson case. And my interest in teaching murder was to think with my students about how it is that this ultimate crime is treated, or how it lives in law, literature, and popular culture. After all, what Russian novel doesn't involve a murder? What Greek tragedy doesn't involve murder? What Shakespeare play doesn't involve a murder. And I was interested in doing things like seeing whether we could understand the motivations and meanings of murder by reading in law literature and popular culture. And that's what propelled me into the subject. Part of my scholarly interest is I'm interested in the justifications for the legal system's use of violence. And I ask myself, how is the violence that law does and that law authorizes different and better than the violence to which law is opposed? And then murder, you see, is that thing, that ultimate crime to which murder is opposed. And I was interested in the moral question, if you will. What is the best way of responding to this ultimate offense? And what we were just talking about a minute ago when we were talking about capital punishment was part of that exploration. Now, over time, the subject of murder has evolved. It's evolved as we've confronted things like terrorism and asking the question, should we think about terrorism through the lens of ordinary murder or the police use of lethal force? Are the laws of murder adequate to respond to the law's use of lethal force? So my commitment as a teacher of undergraduates, is to help students think beyond what they know. It's important to know things, but it's important to be able to think beyond what you know. Einstein once said, imagination is more important than knowledge. Knowledge equips you to understand the world as it is. Imagination helps you understand worlds that have yet to be. And in teaching a course like murder, I wanted to ask my students to, if you will, think beyond what they knew, to think about when, if at all, is the use of violence by law justified as a response to the crime of murder.
No, the O.J. Simpson's a very interesting case. We really loved having Professor Dershowitz on a few months back, and there you have an issue where there was a lot of question with the final verdict, but at the same time, when you have so much question in life, having a finality, which is what capital punishment is, it's a finality. There's no reversal ability. It's something that must be called into question. And so from my vantage point.
May I just say one thing about what you just said? Because I think that's actually a critical insight. So another way to think about the death penalty is to ask the question of whether the death penalty is compatible with democratic politics. So what does democracy allow? It allows for reversibility. It allows us to look at something, the performance of a political leader or the performance of political institutions, evaluate it and decide, no, we want to change our mind.
Yes.
And I love what you said. It is the finality of capital punishment. It is the belief that we know who this person is and what their crime is worth for now and all times. That raises questions about whether the death penalty is in fact compatible with democratic politics, its spirit of openness, and its spirit of reversibility.
And when you consider Alexander Hamilton, who now obviously, thanks to this fantastic show, has become such an even bigger force, I think of one of his lines, which is that these rights presuppose government, and so government's there to protect those rights, and to take life away is to extinguish 100% of kind of the responsibility, if you will, that the government has to each and every citizen. And so if that citizen is then later on afterwards found to have been innocent, the government failed. And so it's essentially, we're running a mechanism, capital punishment, which allows for the failure of the state, which, to think about it from a purely logical point of view. So it's a very interesting question. The last 6 murders that took, or not murders, but the last 6 federal executions, were those political in your opinion?
So I believe the death penalty is inescapably tied in with politics. I believe that the resumption of the federal death penalty exemplifies the ways in which the death penalty is always inescapably intertwined with politics. The resumption of the federal death penalty in July and August and September of this year, it seems to me, is not coincidental with the campaign theme of President Trump and his desire to run on law and order. We know that Vice President Biden now opposes the use of capital punishment. So my sense is that the resumption of the federal death penalty was timed in such a way that the President of the United States could use it to accuse Joe Biden of being soft on crime.
Professor Sarat, I think you should find a TA in time and have the data of federal death penalties charted out over 50 years and look for correlations to elections. And I think that it also might not be, but that's why you should have a TA do it, not yourself. But it also might yield some interesting results. Is capital punishment a purely political play?
Well, I don't know that it's purely political. I wouldn't say it's purely political. And defenders of capital punishment would say people are executed because they've committed capital crimes. That is true in one sense. But there's nothing inexorable about our commitment to capital punishment in the United States. In fact, if you look at what's happened to the death penalty in the United States since the late 1990s, the death penalty is withering in the United States. The number of death sentences is way down from what it was at the end of the 1990s. The number of executions has been cut substantially from what they were at the end of the 1990s. Public support for the death penalty is at historic lows. So I think the death penalty in the United States is a kind of leftover, a kind of holdover. That doesn't mean that we're not going to continue to execute people. I think the progress towards abolition of the death penalty, which I think will come, I think progress towards the abolition of the death penalty is going to be a kind of 2 steps forward, 1 step back of progression. The resumption of the federal death penalty is part of that 2 steps forward, 1 step back progression. And if you're as old as I am, you remember the use of the death penalty as a campaign issue in 1964 by Barry Goldwater, in 1968 by Richard Nixon, in 1988 by George H.W. Bush, and including actually Bill Clinton's 1992 presidential campaign. So there's lots of evidence that there's a political side to the death penalty.
Yes.
Politicians have used it, and for as long as it is around, they will continue to use it.
Yes, you mentioned Bill Clinton's campaign, and that reminds me, I did take 5 of your classes at the college, and one of them was film and the law. And I remember you and I had the 100% exact takeaway from Primary Colors. I loved the book, but the movie was just all about, Kathy Bates's character, the second half. The first half was this fun, kind of intertwined, like, let's see how a political campaign takes hold. And boy, did I love it. But then when it became all about Kathy Bates, I was like, okay, I got to grade some papers now. So, and you felt the exact same way. Really interesting. So
I remember it. I remember the disappointment of that film. It's not the only film which you've read a book and then you see the film and you think. And you mentioned before In Cold Blood. That's yet another example where the book was a classic and the book was compelling. But its film representation didn't live up to the book.
I completely agree with you, sir. Yeah, no, well, speaking of books, let's talk about When the State Kills. I still have my copy that I actually got you to sign. I remember you thought it was so dorky of me, but I wanted it signed, and I still have it on my shelf. Wonderful. Tell us about that book and your recent books, of course.
Thanks for asking, Alex. So I started doing research on the death penalty in the 1970s. Justice Thurgood Marshall, in an opinion in a case called Furman versus Georgia, talked about why people supported the death penalty in the United States, and that intrigued me. And really set a research agenda for me. When the State Kills, which is a book that was published at the beginning of the 2000s, was an attempt to understand that question. Why does the public in the United States support capital punishment? And what could we learn about the culture and politics of the United States by studying through the prism of the death penalty? And since the beginning, since that book, since the beginning of the 21st century, if you will, I've written a series of books about various aspects of capital punishment, trying to understand how it is that issues in the death penalty could illustrate issues beyond the death penalty. I wrote a book called Mercy on Trial that examined capital clemency, when governors would pardon people in death penalty cases, because I was interested in the status of mercy. And
was clemency political, or was that, what did you find with that research?
well, first of all, in capital cases, what you see if you look historically is that there's been a dramatic decline in the use of clemency in capital cases associated with the rise of a kind of law and order, tough on crime politics. Mercy is not fashionable in the United States anymore, and that's reflected in the decline in the use of clemency in capital cases. And in general, there are some exceptions to this. The current president of the United States is one exception to this. But in general, when clemency is granted, it tends to be granted at the end of someone's term, because people, again, don't want to be seen, politicians, political leaders, governors don't want to be seen as soft on crime. More recently, I became interested in the question of technology and how it is that technology has been used in state killing. And I wrote a book called Gruesome Spectacles. And this was an examination of every execution in the United States over the course of the 20th century to try to understand how it is that the death penalty in the United States has been sustained by a belief in technological improvement. Most countries beyond the United States have not changed their method of executions. But the United States, again, 100 years ago, more than 100 years ago, most executions were by hanging. Then that was replaced by the electric chair. And at that point, people said, the electric chair will make sure that executions are safe, reliable, and humane. And then after a series of botched electrocutions, proponents of lethal gas made the same claim. The gas chamber will make sure that executions are safe, reliable, and humane. And in 1977, in the state of Oklahoma, that state said hanging is unreliable, the electric chair is unreliable, the gas chamber is unreliable, but lethal injection, that's the technological magic bullet. And as I indicated earlier, we've learned that that is far from the case. And most recently, I published a book called The Death Penalty on the Ballot, because of this interest I have in the relationship between democracy and the death penalty.
Oh, very interesting. So you've shown flaws with the final enactment of capital punishment, and clearly huge amounts of flaws in the actual conviction. I remember in one class, there was a 10-year span, whereas Ohio or Illinois, where you pointed out it was something over a 50% inaccuracy ratio for death penalty convictions. So it's really a very, it's a problem-filled situation, one that I as a non-political individual who believes in civil liberties, I have significant issues with it, and which is why I wanted to talk to you. Of course, the pleasure of talking to you is such an honor and such a wonderful.
Thank you so much, Alex.
No, really, the pleasure was all mine. So, now that we're at the conclusion of our episode, Professor, is there anything else you'd like to add? Any final parting thoughts?
Sure. Again, first, Alex, thank you so much for having me. on. Thank you for the good and probing questions. It's a pleasure to talk with you. I feel honored to have been able to teach you. It's a gift to be able to teach, and it's a real gift to be able to teach gifted students like you were. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. No, that's a pleasure to hear. Like I said, though I've only been a mathematician in terms of ability my whole life, I was just, fascinated by your classes. I was actually on the beach in Sarasota, Florida, spring of 2000. My mother gave me the New York Times, and I started reading all about this murder. I was dead set on Princeton or Yale. But then when I started reading about this murder class, I was like, who is this Sarat guy? And actually, I went up to the Red Room on a tour as a junior at Trinity School, same school as Truman Capote, who we mentioned earlier. And
Yeah.
I thought your class was so interesting. I went and I went to 2 Harvard classes the following day, both of which bored the heck out of me. And as I've mentioned to you, I have absolutely no attention span, so it's very hard. But I did not actually, I had perfect attendance in all of your classes. I did not miss a Professor Sarah class. When you have something valuable in life, you have to take hold of it. So, and that's the way I felt about your teaching. And it was an honor to have you
Thanks.
on today, sir. Be very well.
Thank you so much.
Stay safe during this time.